Let's go ahead and see what happens with our macroeconomic equilibrium when we introduce single and simultaneous shifts of either aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply. So once again, we want to see exactly how our equilibrium changes under these particular constraints. So let's do the simple example first. So example number 1 in this particular section. Suppose that the economy is in long-run equilibrium. So suppose economy is in long-run equilibrium. So we immediately know where our starting point is going to be. Equilibrium, where all three of our curves are going to intersect one another. So this is going to be our initial starting point. So we can immediately go ahead and draw that out just for a benchmark case. Then I want to introduce a specific shock. So suppose that I tell you that consumer confidence decreases. Consumer confidence decreases. And we want to see exactly how our equilibrium is going to change once we introduce this particular shock. So the big question that we want to ask is, what happens in equilibrium? Equilibrium. It might be long-run equilibrium, it might be short-run equilibrium. We won't know until we actually go ahead and do these shifts and see exactly what happens. So starting off point, we always want to go ahead and do what the problem tells us. We are in long-run equilibrium, so we just want to go ahead and draw our initial curves so that all three of them intersect at the same exact point. We have LRAS, we have SRAS 0, and AD 0. So here, exactly at this point, point A, as we'll call it, we know exactly what our price level is going to be. It's going to be PL0, and then we know that we're operating at Q star, or full employment GDP. That's always going to be the case anytime we're in long-run equilibrium. Then we want to go ahead and introduce these shifts. So here, consumer confidence decreases. It's going to be up to you to decide what happens and what curve it's going to affect. Does this shock right here, does it affect long-run aggregate supply? Does it affect short-run aggregate supply? Or does it affect aggregate demand? If you've been following along with all these sort of lectures with these determinants, you're going to know that consumer confidence, it's going to affect consumption. And how exactly is that going to affect consumption? Consumption is going to go down. And if consumption is going to decrease, that's going to have an impact on aggregate demand, and aggregate demand is going to be negatively affected. So we're going to shift our aggregate demand over to the left. So here, this is exactly how you build up these shifts one by one and draw them out in the appropriate direction. Decreases in aggregate demand, we shift the aggregate demand curve over to the left towards the origin, and our new aggregate demand curve is AD1 right here. And where does our new intersection points lie? It lies with our original short-run aggregate supply curve, our new aggregate demand curve, so AD1 right here. Point B, this is going to be our new equilibrium. So as we move the shift right here, we notice that price level is going to be PL1 right here, so price levels are going to be lower. And we also notice that Q1 right here, our output is lower as well. So we're in some type of recession. So in equilibrium, we're going to be at point B, and point B is going to be a short-run equilibrium because this is only where we intersect aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. We don't have all three of these curves intersecting with one another, so we know it's short-run equilibrium. Short-run equilibrium. And we also notice that, hey, price levels are lower and output is lower as well. So lower price level. So there's some type of deflation happening within the economy. And we are in a recession, so we have lower output. So essentially, this is an example of a single shift that is affecting us in this particular example. And it's pretty easy. You just need to go ahead and correctly identify how this shock is going to be affecting our equilibrium. But of course, we can make this a little bit more complex by introducing these simultaneous shifts. So remember, simultaneous shifts are going to be the most complex sort of supply and demand analysis that we do, and we can easily apply it to this case as well on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply side. So let's go ahead and take a look at example number 2. Example number 2, and this is where we introduce two shocks at the same exact time. But the methodology is going to follow along with what we just did in the previous example. So first shock I introduce is, suppose that I say that the stock market booms. Stock market booms. And that causes your stock values to go up, causing your stock values to rise. Causing stock values to rise. And then the second shock I introduce is a national epidemic. A national epidemic that causes workers to be less productive. That causes workers to be less productive. So we can call it coronavirus. We can call it March Madness. We can call it fantasy football syndrome. Whatever your sort of pleasures lie. This just tells you that hey, we're affecting workers to be less productive now. And anytime we deal with simultaneous shifts, for the rest of the semester, especially in this chapter, we're now going to be dealing with symmetric shifts. So anytime we deal with these simultaneous shifts, we're now going to assume that the shocks are of equal magnitude. Assume shocks are of equal magnitude. So we know for sure exactly to draw them out in the same exact ratio, the same exact length. We are not going to be dealing with the asymmetric shifts anymore. So what exactly is going to happen with our equilibrium based on these two shifts that we see right here? Let's go ahead and draw this out. So we always start off in long run equilibrium. So always start off with your benchmark case and you're going to be good to go just to go ahead and start us off. So here we have AD0, we have aggregate demand 0, we have SRAS 0, and then right at the intersection we have LRAS. We have the price level, we have quantity, we have GDP, and we know that exactly at this intersection right here, point A, we have price level 0, and we're at Q star level of GDP, our full employment level. So now we have to go ahead, introduce both of these shocks at the same exact time, draw them out in the appropriate direction, and we'll know for sure exactly what happens with our equilibrium. So take each shock one by one. First shock, stock market booms causing your stock values to rise. Does this affect LRAS? Does this affect SRAS? Or does this affect AD? So if the stock market booms, causing your stock values to rise, it's going to affect aggregate demand. It affects your consumption. So here, your wealth is going to increase. Wealth increases because you notice that, hey, you're richer now, your stock values have gone up, and if your wealth increases, that causes consumption to go up. So here, consumption is a component of aggregate demand, so therefore, you notice that aggregate demand is going to go up. We shift aggregate demand over to the right away from the origin. So here, we're at AD1. Second shift, a national epidemic that causes workers to be less productive. Is this going to affect LRAS or SRAS? And as we've noted in the previous video, we rarely shift LRAS unless we are explicitly told to do so. So anytime we introduce simultaneous shifts, we typically are going to shift aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. One will affect AD, the other will affect SRAS. In this instance, SRAS is going to go ahead and decrease because workers are now less productive. Less productive workers just say, hey, we're not going to be able to produce as many goods and services as before. So SRAS shifts to the left towards the origin. And we shift it over to the left as such. So here it goes to this way, SRAS1. And where is our new intersection going to lie when both of these shifts have to happen at the same exact time? Our new intersection point are going to be where these green lines and this blue line meet, so SRAS1, AD1, the curve that we just drew out, and the LRAS curve, and that's going to be our point B. And what do we know at point B? What can we know for sure? We know for sure that at point B, what type of equilibrium are we left with? We're left with short and long run equilibrium. We're in short run equilibrium because this is where the SRAS curve and AD curve intersect with one another, and we're also in long run equilibrium because we're also intersecting the long run aggregate supply curve as well. So this is a case where we are both in short run and long run equilibrium. And what do we notice at point B right here? We notice that, hey, price levels are much, much higher than before, so the price level is higher. Price level is higher, so we have some type of inflation. But what about GDP? We remain at the same exact amount of GDP. So remember the sort of keywords that we had. It's indeterminate, unknown, or stays the same. We can say that aggregate output or GDP is exactly the same. Remains the same. So aggregate output remains the same. And remember, anytime we have these equal magnitude shifts, at least one of these variables is going to be seen as unknown or indeterminate. So essentially here, we've tackled exactly what happens to our macroeconomic equilibrium when we have single shifts and simultaneous shifts. And of course, we're going to focus a little bit more on the simultaneous shifts case because this is the more realistic case that we have in application. Once again, get a lot of practice with these determinant shifts being shared to identify what determinant affects which curve and to draw them out in the appropriate direction, and you'll be able to see exactly what happens with our macroeconomic equilibrium. We'll go ahead, do a little bit of a history lesson in the next video with the Great Depression, and then we'll take a look at the two special cases of inflation with demand pull inflation and cost push inflation, which is going to deal with these simultaneous shifts in much more greater detail.